to have that so that we could at least,
Sure, we're gonna start admitting people now.
Okay.
But
that way we can.
yeah,
also
it's
have that.
yeah, so there might be some apps that have word cloud functionality. I don't have them installed, but if you have the Zoom app, then we can in the future maybe see what different options we have.
Okay.
All right, welcome everybody. We'll get started in just a moment here, just give people a chance to get themselves settled in. And as you may have noticed, this is Zoom meeting, so your cameras and microphones are enabled. You can turn them on and off yourself. Let's give it another 30 seconds or so here. Do a quick mute all here. All right, so welcome everyone to today's webinar, or maybe more appropriately a Zoom meeting. As you may have noticed, we are in a Zoom meeting rather than our webinar platform, which means that your cameras and microphones are enabled so far. I just did a mute all just so that everyone has a pristine listening environment, but you can unmute yourself on your own. You can enable your cameras, and we'd highly encourage you to do so just so that we can all get to know each other a little bit better over the course of today's meeting. Per usual, the housekeeping item with Zoom meeting is to keep your microphone muted if you're not speaking, just to limit interruptions and background noise and so on and so forth. But during any kind of open discussion period, feel free to unmute and speak. And if you are, for whatever reason, unable to do so, then you can certainly use the chat. So without further ado, I want to hand it off to Philip Huang.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate it. Good afternoon and welcome to today's coffee break. If you're looking for advice about planning your state and/or regional annual conference, then you are in the right place. My name is Philip Hunt, and I have the pleasure of serving as University Registrar at North Dakota State University. I also proudly represent each of you on the ACRAO Board of Directors as Vice President for Leadership and Management Development. Today, I will be the moderator for this coffee break. I'm joined today by our esteemed panelists, Christopher Huang, Director of Institutional Effectiveness and Registrar at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago, and Tina DeNeen, ACRAO's Associate Executive Director for Meetings and Partnerships. Many thanks to Chris and Tina for putting this event together. As we get started, I'd like to share a quote from Walt Disney that speaks in part to why we're here today. And it says, "Times and conditions change so rapidly that we must keep our aim constantly focused on the future." As we all know, the only thing constant in life is change. So let's embrace that change and keep focused on the future. As you can see on the agenda, we have specific topics that we want to be sure to address, but we also want to give you ample time to ask the panelists questions and then even each other. So don't worry, we will reserve some time for that. So let's begin. To start, we have a polling question that we would like everyone to respond to. We very much want to know your goals for today's coffee break. What is it that you most look forward to learning about today?
I always forget to get the Jeopardy music queued up for these.
You know, I'm always impressed with you, Mike, but I would have been really impressed had you had that going.
Yeah, it would have been something else, that's for sure. I'll give it another let's say 10 seconds here.
Got some good stuff coming in.
And you should all be able to see the results there.
Looks like 100% have responded.
All right. So a lot of all of the above and some facilitating engagement networking. Great, because we're going to cover all of those. Okay. So thank you for completing the first poll. And now I would like to kick things off with a question for our panelists. Tina and Chris, please feel free, either one of you, to jump in for the first answer here. And we're going to start with conference delivery modes. We often hear people talk about virtual meetings, hybrid meetings, live and on demand. Can you start us off by describing the differences in these types of delivery modes?
I don't mind taking that one, Chris. So it's confusing when you begin to talk about these different terms because they mean something different to everybody. So the biggest advice is to just define what you mean by it. But what we mean by it and what we've seen others in the field, virtual meeting, of course, is just a meeting that happens online rather than having participants together physically in the same location. We do that just about every day now as we've incorporated Zoom into our lives since the pandemic. A hybrid meeting is any combination of delivery modes. So when most people talk about having a hybrid meeting, they're referring to a meeting that occurs in person, which also has a virtual component happening at the same time. Presenters could be in person while attendees are virtual, or virtual and in person. Or presenters could be virtual while the participants are on location or also virtual. So a hybrid meeting can mean any combination of those things. And other kinds of terminology that you hear a lot about is you hear about a live meeting or something called simulive and on demand. A live meeting is when the presentation is happening in real time. A simulive meeting is just another term for simulated live. And so that's when a presentation happens at the time that's listed on the schedule, but it was pre-recorded. And if any of you attended the annual meeting this past year, those were mostly simulive. If they weren't Zoom meetings, they were pre-recorded meetings, but they launched at the time, at the session time. So it gave the appearance that they were a live meeting. And then on demand are sessions that can be viewed by the attendees at their convenience. So think of that like Netflix. You can find the session in the schedule, you find the session you want to view, and then you view it when it's most convenient for you. So just make sure that you define your meetings in the way that makes sense to you and that you can describe to your attendees.
Great, thanks for that, Tina. Really appreciate that answer. Chris, do you have anything to add to that at all?
No, I think Tina is the expert in this one, coming off the ACRAO annual meeting this past year. So I have nothing more to add. Thank you.
She is. And Tina, on behalf of all of us, thank you, because it was great.
We had fun. It was a lot. It was a heavy lift, but it was a lot of fun. Seeing it come together was a lot of fun.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. Next slide. So now would be a great time for another audience polling question. How will your respective organization deliver your next annual meeting or conference? There it is. Great job, Mike.
Gold star.
Well, you guys are completing it too fast. I'll finish out the clip.
Oh, that was perfect. That was perfect. All right. Well, we've got a number of people, a third saying virtual. We got some in person, hybrid, but then there's just over a third of folks that are saying that they're still unsure. All right. Well, we are here to help and assist for whatever folks need. Okay, moving on now. Best practices. So Tina, Chris, both of you have a great deal of experience in planning virtual meetings, since most of us have not had an in-person meeting in over a year. Can you share some best practices for planning meetings and conferences?
Do you want me to take that, Chris, first? Yeah, I'll go first. So for us, it was like one of the things that we would recommend most is to start by selecting the platform that you want to use for your meeting. So whatever tool you want to use, as we all have learned and experienced, Zoom is a great way to deliver a live virtual meeting or conference for free. And then there are other platforms that range from very inexpensive to those that would be cost prohibitive for most of us. So many of the platforms tend to be fairly inexpensive in vanilla form. And if any of you have implemented a student information system, you know what vanilla means. The more enhancements you add, the greater the cost. So there's something out there for everybody. You just have to know what kind of conference you want to deliver, what you want the experience to be. And as we'll talk about soon, what your budget is as well. And then Slack, if any of you have heard of Slack, Slack is a platform option that can be used for participants to chat during live sessions. So that's a good way to get people to be a bit more interactive. And if you need to lower your overhead, consider pre-recording content and uploading to YouTube. That's free as well. You can link to those recordings from your conference website. So there are many ways that you can deliver a very good conference or meeting without spending a ton of money.
That's great advice, Tina. Great advice.
I can kind of piggyback on some of that as well. So I represent Illinois ACRAO, IACRAO. Sorry, there's a couple of IACRAOs out there. And last year, our conference was virtual. We used Zoom. Our president-elect used his institution's Zoom account, which was the Zoom webinar or a Zoom meeting. And we kind of used it depending on how interactive the sessions were going to be. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we decided was to make it free for our attendees as much as possible. And that was helpful in terms of accessibility, which we'll talk a little about later on in our session. But I think one of the things that to start off with, since Zoom is so prevalent right now, is to work with the speakers or the presenters to figure out which session would work better for you all. If it's something that is going to be more interactive, Zoom meeting is a great way to go. For those that it's going to be more of a formal presentation, Zoom webinar is probably a better way to go. And for each session, last year, we had kind of 2 other helping people for each session. So beyond the presenter. So we had someone who was our facilitator that would obviously greet, make introductions, remind some, of like completing the evaluation tool and so forth, but would also monitor the chat because questions would come into the chat that way. And then we also had a tech person just in case, something happened with Zoom that they could get in and assist and so forth. Because I think for the presenter or the speaker, it's sometimes good for them to just kind of focus on presenting when you're kind of multitasking and so forth. So those are some of the best practices that we had in terms of some of the presentation and speaking.
Okay, thank you. Prior to 2020, most presenters likely didn't have much experience with presenting content virtually. Do either of you have any advice for preparing speakers for virtual presentations?
I like I kind of said a little bit ago, I think just preparing them in the sense of if you're doing a webinar, I think the speaker can't always see the audience. So that's sometimes it takes something to get used to. Another option would be if people can do multiple monitors, that's great. Because then having multiple monitors in the sense of being able to kind of see what is going on live, but also if there's a second monitor, if you have your notes or something like that for your script. Those are some tips that I would say. There was another one, I just kind of lost my train of thought there. But those are some initial ones I would say. I guess I would say too, in terms of using like a laptop microphone or like a headset, I personally prefer kind of a headset just because I think it helps reduce some of the background noise potentially when like a laptop might be able to, might pick up some ambient, surround noise in the background, depending on what your situation is like when you're presenting virtually. So those are just some tips that I have. I don't know, Tina, if you have any others that you want to jump in there.
Yeah, I know when we were preparing or helping speakers prepare, what we found was that many speakers, of course, who volunteer to present at a conference are typically comfortable with public speaking. However, it's very different when presenting to a virtual audience because you don't have the audience there to offer any nonverbal cues, that help you speak better or know when you're hitting the target. So because of this, what we taught or expected people to do was to rehearse. We encouraged them to rehearse as much as possible. Rehearse in the same place that you plan to do your presentation so that you make sure everything works in the way that you expect it to. Conference planners, if you're planning a conference, you can help presenters by conducting training and coaching sessions. That can include how to set up, like Chris was just talking about, just the logistics of setting up your computer, but also how you should dress and combating any kind of awkwardness. And speaking of dress, we talked earlier about having a simulive meeting. That's something that's simulated live. So it's pre-recorded. And a lot of times the speaker will come in live after that to handle the Q&A. So they do the presentation pre-recorded, then they come in live. You have to remember to remind your speakers to dress in the same clothes that they wore when they recorded the session so that you can trick your audience basically, but it's a really good trick. So another piece of advice that I would have is that you should schedule an official rehearsal at least 1 week prior to the meeting. So just make sure they're using the same equipment that they'll be using during the show, and you shouldn't have any surprises.
Great.
Yeah, usually like we would have, I think 15 to 20 minutes before the session began, they would kind of just touch base in that URL meeting or the Zoom meeting, I guess, just to make sure everything's were going okay and people can hear each other and stuff like that. So that's another tip.
What about business meetings? How are those handled in a virtual environment?
Yeah, for ACRAO, we used Zoom meeting for our business meeting last year. We had 100 or so people attending that meeting, and I think Zoom meeting works pretty well in that you can share screens. You can put the agenda on there, and people can unmute and ask questions of the panelists, kind of like what we're doing now. One of the things that we didn't do last year was the polling. And I think that was something that we could have used for like the actual voting of different motions and so forth. I think we just asked people to unmute and just say yay or nay as we're following Robert's rules. So some other things I guess you could consider would be some other third-party software for polling, or if you need to have approval or something like that. But I think Zoom meeting works pretty well for a business meeting.
I agree. We used Zoom for our business meeting as well. So, and actually Mike Sisson, who's doing our tech support today, is the expert in that. I think he spearheaded that process, but it worked out really well for us too at the national level.
I think something to be cognizant of in terms of Zoom meeting, and just doing a little bit of research, is that Zoom meeting, I think it defaults to 100 people can attend the meeting without kind of upgrading or additional costs. You can add more licenses and so forth, depending on, I guess like there's like an enterprise level or enterprise plus. Zoom webinar, I think goes up to 500, and then you can add more on at increments of 500 or something like that. But
that's correct, yeah. And yeah, a big I guess piece of what platform you end up using has to do with what your expected audience will be. At ACRAO, our Zoom meeting goes up to 300 and our webinar goes up to 1,000, which works so far. But as Chris said, you can increase incrementally if you expect attendance in excess of whatever your license currently has. I was going to say the only other thing in terms of Zoom meeting, the kind of considerations you might want to have is there are security features within Zoom when you're setting it up such that you can limit basically only one person can join per join URL. So whenever people register, just making sure that you put that registration behind some kind of member login so that you limit other people to kind of join the meeting. Not that I think it would be a big concern, but in terms of making sure the election is actually your voting members, that Zoom doesn't have the ability to authenticate them. So you have to find some way of doing that beforehand. I see a hands up there. Is Diana, if you want to speak?
I just wanted to throw out there for FACRO, Florida ACRAO, we did a virtual conference in June, and we decided to actually, as an organization, purchase our own Zoom licenses and cloud storage that went with it, because we wanted to record all of our sessions and put them in one place where our tech person could download them and work with them. We talked about using individual institutional licenses, but that would have made them stored all over Creation. And while we did that for some other things we had done, we did not want to face that. So it's about, I think, $1,200 a year, $100 a month. We're paying for our 5 Zoom licenses and the storage, but for us, it was well worth it.
That's a great idea. Thanks for sharing that. Okay, Mike, next slide. I'm sure that most of us have been involved in conversations about inclusivity on our campuses. How is inclusivity impacted by virtual meetings?
We try to do a lot, Philip, thanks for that question. And we try to do a lot about inclusivity for our meetings at the national level. And when we're talking about inclusivity, it can mean a lot of different things. But what we've learned is having to pivot to virtual meetings as a result of the pandemic meant that access to the meetings was open to more people. We were more inclusive because people who aren't necessarily the decision makers on their campus and didn't always get to travel to conferences could then come to conferences because they didn't have to leave their campus, and the meetings cost a little bit less as well. So it was a lot more inclusive in that way. So I would just suggest that you think about those things, even moving in the future, even if by some miracle we could snap our fingers and everything could go back to normal tomorrow. We should really rethink what normal looks like, because we don't want to shut the door to that entire audience who didn't get the chance to come and participate in professional development in the past. So we'll probably want to keep virtual meetings or virtual components as a thing going forward. And also in your meetings, think about diversity, not just inclusivity, but diversity as well. So when you're hiring speakers, or maybe not hiring, at the national level for some of our meetings, we do hire some plenary speakers, but for any speakers that you engage or presenters, make sure that it represents your association. And diversity, not just in terms of ethnicity or race, think about gender, think about institution size and type, even think about new members versus using the same people to do presentations all the time. So when you think about inclusivity and diversity, it just means more as we're talking about virtual meetings. So those were some of the things that we try to do. We try to have a volunteer program committee that's diverse. We try to get diverse sessions that we are delivering. So just consider those things as well.
And just to piggyback on what Dina was saying, we saw at least our conference numbers doubled, in terms of attendance last year, just by making it virtual, and obviously, not having a cost with it too. But also another part in terms of inclusivity, our association tends to be registrar heavy. Maybe that's just something that's maybe unique to us, but I don't think it is. And so I think one of the things that we're always kind of conscious of is also making sure that we have enough admissions kind of focused sessions so that our admissions counterparts feel like their sessions and presentations for them too. So just some other things to think about in terms of inclusivity.
Great, thank you. And then as a follow-up, to the question on inclusivity, how can we make sure that our meetings are accessible?
Yeah, and I'll start with this a little bit. I think when you're in person, it applies. It applies both in person, but also quasi virtually too. For in person, obviously, you're thinking about more ADA compliance type stuff. That there's like doors that are wide enough or set up is wide enough so that if someone was in a wheelchair that could attend the conference, that there's ramps to be able to get around and so forth. I think one of the things too that we were thinking about as well is just making sure when we were in person that there's each podium or each room had a microphone in it. That was something that came to light a couple of years ago because we were pretty much our conferences were small, so some of the sessions wouldn't have any microphones. But if someone does have a hearing loss or a hearing disability, they're not going to obviously say, "Hey, I can't hear you." They would just sit closer to the front. So I think just being conscious of some of those things can help in terms of accessibility. Thinking about if you have people who have or nursing, having a room available for them to attend, so that they can have their privacy and so forth. So those are some of the things in terms of accessibility in person. For online, I think if possible, having closed captioning available, if there's like a video that's being shown as part of the presentation so that people can read what's being said on the screen. Also, having people introduce who they are when they're speaking can help so that people can kind of know and kind of describe themselves a little bit as much as they're comfortable with. Just again, to help make that connection as well. So those are just some things. I don't know if Tina, you have any other thoughts? Oh, you're on mute.
I muted myself, sorry. I was just thinking that we did the polling question and 21% of you said that you plan to have an in-person meeting for your next meeting. So as we're talking about accessibility, you might not think about this, but you will soon. If you're going to require masks or if masks are optional for your in-person attendees, if you give out masks or if you have corporate sponsors at your meetings and they give out masks, let's make sure that we have some that have the mouths that are clear, that you can see through, so that people who are hearing impaired, can still be able to read your lips. So they do have those out there. You can brand them. They're really not that expensive, but it's a consideration for those who don't have, who aren't able to hear as well, and particularly when speakers are wearing masks.
That's a great point and great reminder, Tina. Thank you.
Just another real quick thing as we're thinking about inclusivity, accessibility. Even in Zoom land, just so you know, I don't know if people know this, but if you click on the 3 bars kind of in your profile, you can rename your how your name displays on the Zoom. And then if you click on rename from the drop down, you could add like your pronouns and so forth and that type of stuff. So that's little tips and tricks, I guess, again, to make it a more inclusive conference or meeting.
Thank you both for that. Some great advice on inclusivity. Can you both now please share some lessons learned over the past year as you've had to pivot from in-person to virtual meetings?
Yeah, so for me, what we want to try to remember, and it's very difficult to do, is not to try to make your virtual meeting just a mirror of your in-person meeting. They aren't the same. They don't function the same and they shouldn't function the same. So don't try to just stuff, what do they call it, a round peg into a square hole. Just make sure that you're programming a bit differently. One of the things that we did learn, we did a lot of research before we had our first annual meeting. Actually, SIM 2020 was our first virtual meeting. So we learned from that. And then we had the annual meeting in 2021. We did a lot of research. They talked about the length of the conference and the length of the sessions. What the research says was to expand the number of days of your conference so that your individual sessions can be shorter. Because as you know, people get fatigued being on the camera all the time or being on Zoom all the time. And so we did that. But what we learned from our attendees from the annual meeting in particular is that they would have preferred to have longer sessions because it had been so long since they'd interacted with each other and they enjoyed kind of that camaraderie and community. So I would suggest that you just, if you can, and you can use SurveyMonkey or something that's not, doesn't have a cost associated with it, I would survey attendees or survey your population to see what they want. Just ask the question and then design the meeting around what their expectation is. And that would be a bit more, that will make you a bit more successful. And then another lesson is to have a timeline. Like it was hard for us and hard for you guys, I know too, because we didn't really have a blueprint. We didn't have anybody, we had to pivot very quickly and we didn't have a blueprint. So we had to make it up. So just like you do in your regular positions, just have a timeline for the project. We use a project management tool called Asana, and we just work backwards from the meeting, what needs to happen and at what point. So having a planning timeline was one of the greatest lessons we learned because it added, not having one for the first meeting that we did, just added a lot of stress because we didn't know what balls were dropping and, you know, we were just trying to figure it all out. But when you have that timeline reminding you at every point along the way, it becomes a little bit easier.
And I'll jump into just talk about like some like planning and the use of volunteers or committees for ACRAO. And this was actually started, we used kind of 4 different committees that was started, I think, a couple of years ago, just because it used to just be basically a local arrangements committee when we were in person. So we had a conference program committee that would review obviously content and just some logistics. We work with membership committee just to make sure people who had registered and stuff like that were members, member institutions. We obviously had a technology committee. They kind of morphed into more like Zoom than the microphones and AV and other things that they had done more in person. And then we also use a vendor committee. And so the president-elect would convene everybody together. And I think as kind of Tina's point, as we got closer to the actual meeting, they would meet more frequently just to go over different logistics and so forth. And another tip I would say too would just be to have a communication plan. Obviously, in terms of Zoom world, a lot of things are happening or a lot of things could go wrong potentially. And so they had a communication plan that basically they had some email templates set up, ready to go. And then their communication plan was like every morning they would send out a notice to all the attendees, just what are the changes, what's new, reminders and so forth. And Mark had said that they kind of created especially templates for if technology was going to be down, like so that they could just have that ready to be sent out, like, oh, sorry, we're experiencing a technical issue, we're working on it, we'll get back to you. Unfortunately, email kind of became the primary way for us to communicate that message. I don't know if there's other tools that could help in terms of communicating. We had some information on our public website as well, but I think people are pretty used to email, so that was kind of the main way that we used for communicating.
Yeah, I agree with you, Chris. We did the same thing for the annual meeting. We did messages every evening after the meeting for that day, and then early in the morning before the meeting that day. And then other than email, you could use a mobile app if you have access to one. But again, if budget is a concern for you, a mobile app is going to add to your budget, and email works just as well. So that's what we use too.
And to circle back on your first comment about like kind of not making your in-person conference and just delivering it to a Zoom or a virtual environment. Usually for ACRAO, our conference is 2.5 days. But we made it basically a 5-day session, and not full days either. There were certain parts, I think, just because Zoom fatigue was real at that point. And so we spread it out a little bit, which was nice. I think it was a good pace.
Okay. Mike, next slide. So Chris, I believe you have some resources that you wanted to share with everyone today. And if you feel the need to share your screen, please do that.
Yeah, so I'm putting on my, I'm chair of ACRAO State and Relations Committee. So I just wanted to share some resources that are available to you all that you may or may not know are available on ACRAO's website. So hopefully you see my ACRAO website page.
Yeah.
I'm sharing my screen. Yeah. Okay. So from the main screen, if you hover under Who We Are tab and then go to State and Regional, that's where a lot of information is available to you. One of the things that we heard from the leadership actually was, how do you update your leadership roster? So there's a button for that real quick, because we know at annual conferences, that's when leadership turnover, you have the new president-elect, maybe new treasurer, new officers coming on board. There's also a way to request an ACRAO rep to attend your meeting. That's on this quick link here. One of the resources we wanted to share is the how-to guide. This is a free guide for state and regionals. You can just click on that and download it. I think chapter 5 is the one on conferences. So that's a free download for you all. And then we did some webinars last year that kind of all the authors who presented who wrote some of the chapters, and you can click on the webinars themselves. You have to register to view the recording. But once you put in your information and so forth, it'll bring you there and you can access it, kind of like what Tina was saying about on-demand or asynchronous type of sessions. Those were recorded, so that's available for you all. So those are just some of the things that we wanted to highlight. Some other quick things is that we do have a state and regional listserv as well that you can subscribe to. And then we do have a state and regional Facebook group as well. And there's communication that goes out that way, but also it's a nice chance to network. So those are just some of the quick resources I just wanted to share with you all, just from ACRAO's perspective that you may or may not know is available to you all.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Now is the time where we would like to open up questions from our audience. And so feel free to put something in the chat or raise your hand at this time.
Yeah, there was already a question I think that Jonica had asked in the chat about.
Yeah, Jonica and Carrie.
Yeah.
Let's see if I can find it here.
So it's saying.
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to know if there was or are any limitations based on how COVID is still happening. So were anyone or any associations, regional or national, doing any in-person events? If so, how are you handling that in terms of contracts, liability, having conversations with your membership?
So at the national level, our next meeting, well, we have a few virtual meetings, but our first in-person meeting since 2019 is going to be our SIM meeting, which will be in Miami, Florida. Yes, I said Florida. I understand what that means. So we're just watching right now, watching very carefully. We really do think that we're going to be able to have the meeting in person. We're already contracted. So we're contracted like 5 years out. So it really wasn't a matter of renegotiating a contract at this point. So the plan is to be there. We are covered with insurance if something were to happen that we could not be there. But the plan is to be there, and we're working on a safety plan as well so that everybody knows what our policies are with regard to mask wearing, social distancing, whether you have to be vaccinated or not, we'll have all of that written out. We will likely hire a third-party company to implement some of those things. You know, they will collect vaccination verification. They will do sign-ins each morning before people are allowed to come into the conference center. They have to stop at this desk and either show, check in as a vaccinated person or have their temperature checked or take a rapid test for COVID there. We haven't figured out all of those details yet. We're meeting about that on Tuesday, actually. But yeah, we are planning to have that in-person meeting. And we hope it happens because people have talked about just being really excited about it. But at the same time, we want to make sure that people are safe. You know, we don't want to have a meeting that's going to expose anybody unnecessarily. So it's quite a fine line that we're going to have to work through moving forward because this is just going to be our lives in the future. You know, we're just going to have to figure it all out.
And I don't know if ACRAO would stipulate anything in terms of state and regionals. I think that's going to have to be a state by state or state and regional type of decision, whether or not you all want to have an in-person conference and what are those regulations based on your state guidelines and mandates there versus in a virtual. I know ACRAO, we were wrestling with that question because I mean, last year, you know, we were hopeful that we would have an in-person, but we made the decision for this coming year to keep it with a virtual. And I think when we were looking at the contract, it was written in the sense that, you know, obviously, I think people are like the hotel that we were using for our conference. I think they knew when we signed it that these were unusual times, right? And so there was a clause about, you know, like act of God type of stuff. But they were just, I think people are willing to work with you if you do need to get out of your contract that you had signed. If you have a legal team, those are some things maybe to work with them. But I think in our experience, most of the hotels were pretty willing to just work with us, given all the different challenges that we faced.
And just to follow up on that, Chris, in 2020, when COVID first hit and we were having to back out of hotel contracts, the hotels were very willing to work with us on those. As we moved into 2021 and currently, they're a little less willing to work with us because they're losing money very rapidly as well. So instead of canceling meetings, what we did was we rebooked for a future meeting. So that kind of helped the hotel and helped us as well and kind of mitigated some of the financial loss. But yeah, just make sure that you have contacts that you can talk to. Don't take no for an answer. Everything is negotiable. So just because they tell you no the first time, just be irritating and keep talking to them because a lot of times they'll make it happen. They'll talk to the right people to make it happen.
Okay. So there's one in it. Carrie, did you get your question answered by any of the information shared previously? Or do you still have a question for what you posted in the chat? Is Carrie still on?
Yep. Yes, she said yes, and thank you.
Okay.
As I guess that she got her question.
Okay, perfect. All right, and then I saw another one. Where'd it go? Okay, here we go. From Jerry Becker. Has anyone conducted a hybrid conference? If you have an in-person conference, there can be significant costs involved. If virtual attendees can attend for free or reduce costs, I would expect in-person attendance to decrease, which makes covering the cost of the conference problematic. How did you handle your pricing structure to make sure you covered the cost of the associated in-person portion of the conference? And I see there was some responses there, but if anybody else wants to respond to Jerry.
So Jerry, what I would suggest and what a lot of people in the profession are doing or suggesting is that if you're going to have an in-person conference, have your in-person conference. Don't try to make it hybrid necessarily, because having a true hybrid meeting is pretty cost prohibitive. If you're trying to do live streaming to a virtual audience, that is very costly. So what I suggest, and what we will likely do for our meeting, is we will record some of the sessions at the in-person meeting, and then we will take those and package them to launch at a separate time for our virtual meeting. So it won't be the same experience. And then that way you're not making people have to make the choice, should I come in person or wait for virtual? Because there is some value to the in-person. There are going to be some things that people miss if they don't come to the in-person meeting. But we will have very relevant content that we can launch and share virtually as well. And you can charge less for that. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. But having a true hybrid meeting, just be aware that that's very cost prohibitive for most of us.
Thank you, Tina and Diane. I appreciate your feedback.
Sure, you're welcome.
Just real quick, I know I was reaching out to Michigan ACRAO because I think they've done a couple of sessions where they've had a live stream and an in-person, and maybe a little bit of a tease. I think they'll plan to submit a session for the annual meeting conference just to share some of their successes or tips and tricks. But I agree with well, not but what Tina said, that I think live stream, while it's great, there is a cost associated with that, obviously. And so I guess you can involve your treasurer if you really want to do like a cost analysis to see where the break-even point might be.
Oh, well, I am the treasurer. Thank you.
So we have time for one more question for this open mic session. Anyone have an additional question that's burning in their minds? Jonathan.
Yeah, I apologize, I came in late, so if you've answered this question, certainly let me know. But I was typing in the chat, but it tended to be too long, so I thought I'd ask. So I'm with ACRAO, and we had an awesome virtual conference this past year, our largest attendance ever. So it was definitely very popular. We learned that there's a lot of interest in that. A lot of folks can send more folks to the conference and participate if it's almost zero cost, and we didn't charge anybody for it as long as you were a member of the association. So anyway, so we've got a conference coming up in February, and obviously we contracted about 4 or 5 years ago for this, and so pandemic wasn't even on the radar, and we've built into the contract. We got F&B, we got minimum room requirements, all that's built into the contract. So, but we want to be cognizant of the virtual community as well, that there's definitely interest there. And so with that, I don't know, our challenge is to provide that, but also still meet those contract requirements. So I guess what we're toying with right now is the idea that if there are any presenters who are unable to attend the conference, maybe because of travel restrictions or whatever, maybe they could simply, they could present virtually from their home institution. We could set up a room with a screen and a microphone and while at the conference, and those could be virtually shared to the membership who cannot attend, but also the ones who are there can sit in the room together and watch the presentation as well and interact with the presentation. I guess I'm looking for other strategies of getting around contract requirements. That's kind of a stickler right now. Obviously, going into future contracts, we're going to take this into account, but right now we're kind of stuck. So I don't know if that's a question or a comment or where that falls, but any thoughts along those lines would be very helpful.
Yeah, Jonathan, I feel your pain, especially. One thing, let me just comment on what you said about having the presenter present virtually while you have people in person together listening to it. Just one piece, and that's a great idea. Just one piece of advice is also have that presenter pre-record their presentation, just in case there are any tech issues on that day. I mean, it could just be a thunderstorm and he gets cut off. So just make sure it gets pre-recorded so that you could play it for your attendees in case something happens on that day. But otherwise, that's a great idea. And with regard to food and beverage minimums, just work with your hotel representatives. We have found that they've been very willing, while they have not been as willing to cancel and let us out of our contracts, without a penalty, they've been very willing to reduce the food and beverage minimums. So just talk to them about that. If you expect your in-person attendance to be less, you probably also have a room block minimum. Just ask for that to be reduced as well. And they've been pretty good about doing that.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, thanks for your questions. So this coffee break topic was very timely, and we appreciate ACRAO for allowing us to gather today. I'd like to thank Mike Sisson. Thank you, Mike, for today's technical support. And thank you again to Chris and Tina for sharing your time and expertise. As we prepare for how to best assist you in the future, we would like to ask one last polling question. In what ways would you like to see ACRAO assist SNR officers with in the future? Please select your top 3 choices. Right. Oh, that's great.
Imagine you had invested in Google.
What was that? A free advertisement.
That was just
If
the
we
ad
had,
after.
we'd all be rich.
The Jeopardy.
We probably wouldn't be on this call, right?
We had to pay for this some way.
Thanks, everybody, for that last question. All right, just a couple of other things before we get out of here. I got a couple more slides. Just want to remind folks of a few upcoming ACRAO events. Mike, you there? Next slide, please. First, we hope to see you online at some of our upcoming free webinars. Join us on the EDGE monthly user group on August 19th to talk about best practices in international credential evaluation and new research in the EDGE database. And on August 25th, we will hear about a new institution, the U.S. Naval Community College, and how their work is changing naval education. Then on August 30th, please join members of the Women's Caucus as they discuss We Should All Be Feminists at the ACRAO Book Club. Also, save the date for our virtual technology summit that's going to happen September 29th through 30th, where we'll talk about the technology of transfer now and for the future. ACRAO understands that meaningful data exchange is not only the right thing to do to streamline credit evaluation for our learners, it's also a matter of business continuity in our current environment. And ACRAO wants to help you and your institution get there. Please join us to stay up to date in this fast-paced environment. We're also, as Tina mentioned, we're also looking forward to seeing each other at the Strategic Enrollment Management Conference in Miami, November 14th through 17th. This will be our first in-person meeting since 2019, and we are all excited to be together again, safely, of course. And finally, the call for proposals is open for ACRAO's annual meeting, which will be held April 3rd through 6th in 2022 in Portland, Oregon. Please submit a workshop, roundtable session, or stop and share topic for consideration for an in-person meeting by August 31st. A later call will be open for virtual only submissions. And then lastly, thank you all very much for sharing your time with us this afternoon. We look forward to seeing you again soon. And in the meantime, feel free to contact us if you have any further questions. And in the words of my good friend, Chris, we wish you grace and peace. Take care, everyone.